and will be uploaded for our YouTube page later. I keep on plugging YouTube, and I'm not sure why. It will be uploaded on a miscellaneous video sharing site. The subject of today's panel is on devolved moderation structures. And once again, we have an outstanding group of people to be discussing this. Sherwin is the lead public policy manager for the Wikimedia Foundation. Abby Vollmer is director of platform policy and counsel at Github. Jessica Ashooh is director of policy for Reddit. And Sarah Roberts is co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry and an associate professor in the UCLA Department of Information Studies. As with the other panels, we'll be having a question and answer session towards the end. We very much encourage audience participation. So please do paste your, type your questions into the chat, and we'll work towards them at the end of the session. Sarah, thank you very much. Do you want to take it away?
Sure, yes. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever anyone is. We're now doing conferences in real time around the globe. So I don't assume anything about your time zone, but welcome wherever you are. This afternoon, we have an esteemed panel of 3 guests who really, I think the most interesting thing about this panel is the different areas of the internet and platforms and services that they all represent. I think that constitution of the panel points to a very great difficulty in the conversation that we're about to have with regard to what constitutes appropriate strategies to respond to the jurisdictional norms where firms are in the market. And just as content moderation itself is hardly a monolithic practice, the business plans and market strategies for each of these companies, I can only assume, is very distinct and different, as it is for all firms who are dealing with these issues. So I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. I think that I would like to start by offering each panelist an opportunity to, whatever extent he or she wishes, to kind of set the stage for where they are today in a snapshot. Clearly, 20 plus years ago, we thought about the internet based on aspiration of having limitless boundaries and no geography. And as we all know, very famously, some litigation started between nation states and companies. A huge internet player called Yahoo, that some of us may remember, was very famously involved in a lawsuit in France. And we learned that, in fact, that the internet does have geography and is material through that lawsuit. And today, we're still dealing with this issue of how nation states expect their legal and judicial norms to be respected in what we used to call cyberspace. So I think that's kind of the background, and I'd like to offer the panelists an opportunity to pick that up or pick up another angle and talk about how these tensions of being global while also needing to respond locally to these norms are playing out for you. Sherwin, you're nodding, and I'm hoping that means you're having a thought. So would you mind kicking us off?
Sure, happy to. I think one of the things, I want to pick up the question of global jurisdiction in a second. There's a couple of background things I would want to sort of set out about the Wikimedia Foundation and how content moderation happens, just to sort of set the stage. And that's, most of the content moderation is done by users. It's done by editors, right? Wikipedia, the idea behind it is anyone can edit it. So anyone, anywhere in the world can change what's in that. And that's the first line of content moderation, because it's a special purpose website. It's meant to be an encyclopedia. It's not meant to be a vehicle for individual self-expression, meaning that sort of the content moderation is built into what you're engaging in when you join it. You know that this is going to be a thing that other people are going to edit, and you know that it's meant to be creating an encyclopedia. So the moderation is sort of, I think Tarleton Gillespie talks about the moderation makes the platform, and the rules that the community sets in doing that is what makes it what it is. So that being said, the other thing about that is the vast majority of the rules that make Wikipedia an encyclopedia and not just a collection of people's thoughts are things that our community set. The rules that the foundation lays out are a much broader, much more basic sort of thing about, not violating laws, not harassing people, and so on. The rules that make it an encyclopedia, that have people hew to certain standards on, biographies of living persons and being accurate, those are things that the community developed before the foundation existed. Now, I say all of that to get to the geographic part, which is also another feature of how the projects were built, which is they're not meant to be geographically limited. I think, you were talking about sort of the 20 years ago idea of the internet. And this is about the same era of Wikipedia's instantiation. And that's the idea behind it is there are many different Wikipedia projects, but they're subdivided by language, not by geography. The idea being that, yes, we actually do want to have that exchange on the platform of geographies. And so that people who speak the same language can exchange with each other. And so that's a deliberate choice. And it does mean that we've come to the decision that we are located in the United States. The foundation and the servers are located in the United States. And so if we have to pick a jurisdiction, that is the jurisdiction that is going to control. And that's where, but we will receive comments and questions from everywhere, but that's sort of the default of how we're going to operate jurisdictionally.
Thanks, Sherwin. That's a lot of food for thought, including it's excellent, including the ways in which the expectations of users and their own self-governance play into this conversation. I think on that point, that's an excellent segue to talk to Jessica Ashooh from Reddit, because there might be some resonances between what you shared and what Jessica might have to say. Jessica, will you pick up the thread there or share what you would like to about where Reddit sits today on these issues?
Thank you, absolutely, and thanks for having me. Similar to Sherwin, I will start with just a high-level overview of Reddit's approach to platform governance. It is decentralized and user-led, and it's got 3 layers is the best way to describe it. And so Reddit as a website is divided into hundreds of thousands of sub-communities that are organized around interests, and we call these subreddits. All of these subreddits are created by the users and they are moderated by the users on a volunteer basis. These are not Reddit employees, they are just users who are passionate about a particular topic and want to connect in conversation with others who share that same passion for that topic. So we empower these moderators to set their own rules specific to the topic of whatever their community is about. And so as a fairly silly example, but one that proves a point, we have a community called Cats Standing Up. And the only thing that is allowed to be posted in Cats Standing Up is photos of cats standing up on 2 legs. If they're on 4 legs, it'll be removed by the moderators because that's the rule that they've set. Furthermore, the only thing that you are allowed to comment on these photos with is the word cat, period. If you put anything other than the word cat, period, it will be automatically removed by a tool that the moderators of that community have set up. And it's in fact a tool that we provide for all of our communities if they would like to avail themselves of it. And so while that's a very silly example, you can see how communities around more serious topics would leverage tools and rules such as this to keep the conversation respectful, on track, and just meaningful for whatever their community is about. The other layer of user-based governance on Reddit is the upvote and the downvote. So even if you're not a volunteer moderator, you still have a role to play in ranking the content on Reddit. So unlike some of the larger platforms, We don't primarily sort our content based on an algorithm that we as Reddit employees have devised. It's primarily sorted by the upvotes and the downvotes of the users. And I want to talk specifically about the downvote because I think that that's very, very important. Because while there are a number of sites where you can express, affinity for content, you can like it, you can, have a heart or whatever. The downvote is actually where culture of a community is created, because the downvote is really a community expression of taboo and things that are not allowed. And being able to downrank something is very, very important to the information quality and the quality of the conversation that you're having. As an example, I'll use President Trump's Twitter feed. So, he may put something on Twitter and might get 50,000 likes, but you don't see kind of what people would say if they were able to give a negative signal. Whereas on Reddit, you could see that negative signal. And so it's a more accurate indication of how the community is receiving the content. And then lastly, on top of all of this user-based content moderation sits the Reddit content policy, which we set as a company, which applies across all subreddits and to everything. And if you think of Reddit as a federal system, then a content policy is kind of like our constitution. And as Sherwin was saying in the Wikipedia case, ours is similarly high level and principles based and contains kind of the things that you would expect it to contain. So don't encourage violence, don't harass people, don't dox people, things of that nature. And so what the last thing that I'll say is that I think that this community-led and diffuse governance system actually internationalizes very, very well to different jurisdictions, because you have inbuilt in this system of community moderators, people who already know the culture of whatever topic they're involved in, because it's their topic, it's their passion. So we don't need to find people to moderate the Brazil subreddit, because there are Brazilians already moderating it, and there are people who are fluent in the language and the culture and can identify all of the nuances of hate speech or coded language in a way that simply wouldn't be feasible for even the very largest of companies, and certainly not for a company of Reddit size, which is only about 700 global employees.
Thank you, Jessica. That's an excellent overview. I think it's worth pointing out that both Sherwin and Jessica are articulating a modernized and contemporary version of how internet governance in social internet spaces has functioned from the get-go, right? It was user-based, front-facing governance. And one of the changes that we've seen as commercial content moderation has come into play is an effort to create seamlessness in the moderation process, which has actually served to confuse users about the nature of the platforms that they're on and whether or not they're moderated at all. So what we're hearing is, sort of an adherence to an older model that where the math is shown, let's say, on the front end to the user. Very, very interesting to hear from both of you. I want to turn now to Abby Vollmer, who comes to us from Github. And I think it's a fascinating addition to this panel, in part, Abby, because I think if we asked many people, not even just lay people, but people involved in industry, in internet governance, and so forth, think about a site that has a need for content moderation, a social site that has a need for content moderation. How many people do we think would think of GitHub? And yet, of course, right, GitHub has these issues and it has to be thoughtful about this. So I'd like to give you a chance to share with us kind of where GitHub is today and how you are contending with the issues that are maybe unique to your platform and services.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks very much, Sherwin and Jessica, for making this easier for me, because I'm going to echo a lot of the things that you said. But one thing I think to start off with, just in case people aren't so familiar with GitHub, we are a platform, a software development platform. And so this is where a lot of software developers are building software today, and that's often done collaboratively. If you think about, writing anything, you can do it by yourself, but if you get help from other people or have other eyes on it, people can kind of help out, point out mistakes or ways to improve it. That often creates a better result. And so software is no different. And today it's very much a dominant way to build software, that people are collaborating together. So we host that content and really design the platform to help people do that in a way that's constructive, healthy, safe, inclusive. And like Sherwin and Jessica, GitHub, like they described for their platforms, GitHub also has a federated system where we have community moderators and then staff moderation. And the community moderators are using a code of conduct. And I guess to take a step back, the content on GitHub is largely organized in what we call repositories, which is more or less a project. So if you want to start a project on GitHub, you create a repository, we call a repo, and the people who are maintaining that repo, we encourage them to set up a code of conduct. And those are rules for what's okay or not in that project. So along the lines of what Jessica mentioned about cat standing up, I'm not aware of a repo that has that rule, but a code of conduct can say things that are just specific to that project, whatever people want to happen in there, very clearly spelled out. And then there's a layer above that, as Sherwin and Jessica both mentioned, where we have terms of service that include acceptable use policies, community guidelines for things like hate speech, harassment, doxing, et cetera. If that's happening, a maintainer might find it and take action against it, but there are situations where they don't, and we will, or there are situations where we would want to take action beyond just that repository, just that project, and say, we don't want, this person is posing a danger to the entire platform and or doing this in many different repositories, and so we need to take an action against their account. So that's where staff level moderation might be more useful. But like both Wikimedia and Reddit, or all the Wikipedia, all of it, and Reddit. For GitHub, we're designed for a global audience. Our project-based system is very async oriented. People are largely working, in different places and collaborating together on projects. So doesn't make sense for us as a top-level platform to design things to be specific to a locale. And we entrust and try to empower community moderators to design their projects and moderate their projects in a way that fits what their local circumstances, whether that's local geographically or local to a particular topic. But we don't pretend to be the experts in that. We kind of let them take that first shot at figuring out what makes sense for that project.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks to all three of you for a really helpful overview of how things look at a number of levels and layers within your service. I think the title of the platform, Devolving, or thinking about devolution of moderation practices, we might maybe think of the synonym of federating or a federation. You've all described using multiple mechanisms at different layers of relationship to the service, and each one of you has that going on, but really putting kind of a heavy lift on the communities themselves and the community's own representatives in the form of the moderators who are leading the governance practice locally within that community. Again, for those of us who are long in the tooth, we remember the days of Usenet. We remember some of these older experiments in the social life of the internet. You could find antecedents there that expressed a range of governance approaches, from laissez-faire anarchic experiences to draconian no tolerance experiences. And you could, as a user, sort of decide where to spend your time based on what, not only the topic, but what kind of governance suited you and was comfortable to you. And I'm thinking about cats standing up here as one example of draconian, but with a purpose, right? Humor is the purpose, but it's also demonstrating something about the ways in which these community-led governance systems can go. So I think what I'd like to offer now is to open the discussion to the participants today. I think the easiest thing to do would be to if you wouldn't mind posting your questions in the chat, and we can get some conversation going there from the user base. I know we had a question that came in earlier that someone had, I think, written in. Michael, it was the question about what happens when the expectation of the platform's own model becomes gamed or interfered with in an unexpected way. And I believe the question itself, Sherwin, I think you had a look at that question as well. It had to do with how does the platform and its moderation practices consider or deal with a third-party firm who is offering services to write for Wikipedia with the expectation that they have an excellent understanding of how to get things into Wikipedia and get things up on Wikipedia, which for those of you who've ever tried that or been through that process, it's fairly esoteric and difficult. It's not actually super easy to put a Wikipedia page up and have it stay if you are not enmeshed in the norms and expectations of that community. So that might be a question we could turn to, Sherwin, because as the three of you have described your own ecosystems, we're assuming a lot of things right now, including the benevolence of all actors. We're assuming that the ecosystem is somewhat closed and not being affected by third parties and other kinds of, let's say, demands or intentions. So Sherwin, how does Wikimedia think about that issue? I'm sure that the case that was described in the question, which was of a particular firm offering that service, is not the only one.
Right. Yeah. Paid editing is a thing that people have been discussing and trying and wrestling with. It's like trolling, like any number of types of disfavored types of content. It's one of the things that people have been struggling with. It's a hard problem since the beginning. And paid editing is not necessarily in and of itself forbidden, right? The idea is more that people should disclose when they're being hired to do this sort of thing, right? So it's understood that, yeah, this can be a complicated, arcane process sometimes. So sometimes people are going to be able to offer advice on this. On the other hand, what you don't want is somebody basically putting disinformation up there or playing or being a dishonest PR firm, right? Which is what I think a lot of the times is the worry, and that's the sort of the nefarious action that we'd want to prevent. I don't know if that's a subversion of the moderation rules so much as it's a mechanism that, like, people are using the editing mechanism in order to push this particular agenda, which means that one of the advantages of having community developed rules and community context, the way Jessica was talking about, is the ability for those communities to respond and react to that. So both in terms of recognizing it and in terms of adjusting where penalties might come in or where remedies might come in. That being said, a lot of the community developed terms are the ones that are specific and faster to move. So oftentimes they're less broad than what we have as the foundation, as the physical hosts. But a lot of those terms are incorporated into the terms of service for the foundation. So that provides a breadth and a flexibility as well for us when we recognize something has happened and that the community is unable to, for whatever reason, to react to it quicker, we can take action. Now, not always, because we're going to be a little bit more, we're going to want to have more of a hands-off attitude towards this because of sort of the philosophy of Wikipedia is it's not the foundation writing it. So there's some aspects of that involved. And then one other thing that I wanted to key off of that Jessica mentioned, in terms of how useful downvoting is instead of just having likes. And just, it sounds like it's adding one other dimension to a ranking system, but it's not, right? Because it's not just the n plus minus number you end up with. You can sense the volume of that, and there's all sorts of things all sorts of dimensions that can be built out of that one extra number. And I think one of the fun things about Wikipedia and other Wikimedia projects is having an edit function gives you an infinitely larger number of inputs that somebody can have. So you're not just upvoting or downvoting. You have all the dimensions of somebody, I'm going to revert and edit, or I'm going to add a couple of extra words, or I'm going to alter what somebody else added. And that provides community with even more flexibility, but also it provides anybody watching this process with a better understanding of how the content is evolving.
Thank you, Sherwin. That's fascinating. I mean, I think the nuances of the functionality and how the functionality of the services relate to developing governance and moderation practices, there is an enmeshed, intertwined relationship among those things that it's really helpful to draw out. And this is where there's differentiation among the platforms themselves, even if they are attempting to be in the same space. Essentially, the three that we have today, of course, are very different, serving very different needs and with different models. But I think the front end facing amount of tools that users have to engage with and register discontent, let's say, with what is going on in their own community is a very strong aspect across the three. That kind of is a thread and a through line for the three platforms represented today. We have a really great question from an audience member, and it's directed at you, Jessica, but I think this can prompt discussion across the panel. So this is from Roberto Patterson, and he asks, with regard to user-guided moderation, how should one consider those insularly regulated communities who do so simply in service of providing place for communication or ideas which may be considered harmful or may end up prompting harmful behaviors? For example, subreddits which are quarantined. Certainly these are moderated, but to the extent of cultivating a rather hostile ecosystem, albeit to the participants' contentment. So I think, in other words, what do we do with communities where the model of governance and the agreed upon raison d'etre of the community itself poses problems that might be antithetical to the larger constitution of the platform itself, or beyond that, maybe bumping up against legal and other norms? Jessica, I believe that Reddit might have dealt with this issue a few times, so thank you for taking that.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is where our content policy comes in, and kind of the top layer of Reddit's federated system comes in. If there is a community that is dedicated to something that is just out of the bounds of our content policy, then we simply can remove that entire community. And we do, very frequently. We publish a very extensive annual transparency report, and in that you can, we publish the numbers of whole communities that are removed from Reddit per year, and it's of course in the thousands. And so it's something that certainly we need to have a team dedicated to, and we do. But I think that's a real advantage of Reddit, is that it's not trying to police an ocean. We have people organized into these specific communities. And so if you think of it almost as governing a city, you kind of know what neighborhoods might have certain issues, and you can kind of focus your attention on those neighborhoods. And so it's a much more efficient way of governing a platform, and it really helps to focus our attention where it's most needed.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Roberto, for a great question. We have another one here that is going to prompt us all to have to unpack it a bit because it's excellent and it's getting at the heart of the matter. So I would say for all panelists, this is a question from Paul Gowder, who asks if you could speak a bit more to how you create the incentives for this kind of decentralized moderation? In particular, could you speak to the differences between the incentives for moderators operating in discrete special interest platform locales, like the Reddit subs or the specific GitHub repos, some more arcane wiki pages versus broad general interest moderation locales? Of course, those things are likely to be different. And then the second part, thinking about upfront costs to users of becoming effective as a moderator, starting one's own GitHub repo and then being the dictator thereof, getting involved in the committee-style Wikipedia process, et cetera. So I think that's a question more about how do you incentivize this role when the bar for participation itself can be fairly high to even enter into the community in these capacities. And we're using the term moderator. I know that some platforms really think of this as more of a community management kind of approach. So I think those are interchangeable. We think about Wikipedia editors, but that's kind of the whole group that we're talking about. So that's an open question. How do we incentivize and make it appealing to ask users to want to take this on? And then part B, how do we give them the acculturation and support that they need to be effective?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I love the question. It's a really important thing to think about in running a platform. And all of what we've said about empowering our community moderators, that doesn't mean just expecting them to do it all by themselves and not thinking about how we can support them, right? So we do have a lot of resources that we provide, and both in terms of how to approach it, like documentation to think about, and also tooling. So on the documentation side, our community guidelines do have a section about what's not allowed on the platform, but way before you get there, there's a lot of explanation about building a strong community and things to do. Like I should just quote a few things, maybe like be welcoming and open-minded, respect each other, communicate with empathy, be clear and stay on topic. And each of those, there's description about what those can mean. And then what if something or someone offends you, communicate expectations, moderate comments, and then some links to the tooling. So I mean, just trying to help people understand going into this, the moderation aspect and what that means, and kind of how you can, in building your code of conduct, sort of set these expectations clearly and let people know that you'll moderate. But I know for GitHub, it can be a lot of work. And if you're just coming to the platform because you want to build software, you might not want to have to spend your time, looking at these random comments that come up that have nothing to do with what you're trying to accomplish here, and so that can be frustrating too. And I think, it's an important complement to what I've just mentioned about explaining and documenting and all of that, to have tools to be able to use so that it's easier for moderators to take the actions that they need. And so we have, a team at GitHub that works on building tools, and over the years have come up with a bunch of different ways to help, but including like ways to minimize or delete comments, hide comments, even locking conversations, or applying interaction limits onto a repo. And so these things are designed to both create friction and also allow for a cooling down period. Because if you think about, sometimes when these things are happening, it's like a conversation's getting heated. You may not need to like ban somebody from the platform or from your project. I guess the user can't ban them from the platform, but rather than say all you can do is either kick the person out of your project or let them stay in, we have these intermediate steps that people can apply. And so they can just, maybe lock interactions in this conversation for a bit. And then tomorrow, when things are, people are thinking about something else, we can open that up again and let people who are trying to get back to work in there do that. Yeah, so those are just some examples that I think kind of help paint the picture of how we do it at GitHub.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that as well, because I think the incentives question is a really interesting one. But I would actually dispute the premise of it, because at least in our experience, it's actually the very kind of niche, esoteric communities that people are the most motivated to discuss, because it's in many cases the only place on the web where they have that community for that very, very specific thing. Whereas you could find a broad general discussion almost anywhere. And so the incentives there are perhaps not as strong. But I want to double down on what Abby said about the tooling, because that is really, really important to making the job easy and making it feasible for someone to be able to be a community moderator. And we similarly have an engineering team that all they do is come up with mod tools. And I think behind that, the ethos behind that is that we want moderators to be less like janitors and more like, the host of a dinner party or the curator of a museum. It should be fun, stimulating work. And we think that kind of the janitorial work at scale, that should fall on us. And so, we don't want moderators to have to waste their time dealing with spam or kind of other issues at scale. That's on us. Our tools are better to detect that, frankly, and see what's going on from a data perspective on the site. And so we want to take that burden from them so that they can do the fun part and chat with their friends.
And I think I'd echo a lot of that in that I think that most of the types of moderation that people are going to be doing on a Wikipedia are going to be things that are directly in service of improving the article. So if somebody's there on Wikipedia, it's going to be because they want to add something to that article or they want to fix something. And so whether that's adding another citation or adding another fact or removing something that they think isn't quite accurate or that's trying to push a particular point of view or a particular objective, that all sort of like blends together a little bit more than it being somebody going, I want to work on the substance versus I want to be a content moderator. That being said, naturally there are sorts of things that are a little further afield from dealing with the content of the article, right? If somebody's just spamming or just vandalizing pages, all caps screeds, like just paste it into things over and over again. And that is where, again, there's tooling that we've developed at the foundation. There's certain tools that have been developed by community members as well. And those can be used by moderators or other editors to look through recent edits, rank them or find them. There are certain bots that will find very coarse types of vandalism like the all caps screed and revert those things. So there's that combination of, okay, look, hopefully there's enough motivation to do certain types of moderation that are closely related to being a part of that community, just participating. And then for the rest of that, we're hoping that some of the tooling can pick that up and some people who are dedicated, that smaller number of people who do actually dedicate themselves to those tasks can do that much more efficiently.
Thanks to everyone for your responses on that. We have a couple more questions in the queue that I will put to you. This one comes from Art Pericles, and he's asking, first of all, he thanks all of you for your discussion. And this is directed to Jessica and Abby primarily. He says, you talked about the community or repo level. Could you also talk about input from the users on the federation level? Do you see your federated model as being different in that regard as well? Yeah, so what's the interrelationship, I think, among these levels and layers of governance as you've described them on your platform, and how do the users engage?
Yeah, that's a really great question and something that we've been thinking a lot about, especially this year, and evolving our approach to. So at Reddit, we have a community relations team whose entire job is to engage with the moderators and ensure that they understand our rules, ensure that they understand all of the tools that are available to them and how to use them. But it is really important that they also be able to weigh in on matters of the content policy. They're subject to that content policy, so it makes sense they should be able to talk to us about it. And we had been looking for ways to bring them better into that conversation, because I will say in the past we were not particularly good at it. And this is one thing that particularly the racial justice reckoning that the United States experienced this year was something that really impacted our thinking on this. And we made some pretty notable updates to our policy around hateful content in June of this year. And in the process of considering that update, we spoke directly with what we call moderator councils. So, there are different communities on Reddit that may kind of have similar interests. So you might have a group of, subreddits that want to talk about sports. You might have a group of subreddits that want to talk about various different crafting things. And they will all have kind of different needs because they'll engage with the platform in different ways. Some of them may be more visually oriented, some of them may be more text-based. And so it all impacts how they experience Reddit and what they need from us. And so we had a number of community council conversations with communities that were primarily serving minority communities on Reddit because their input was extremely important as we were considering this. And I will say that those conversations were not just kind of at middling levels of the company. They included everyone up to our CEO who participated directly in those conversations as well. So for us, getting user input into how we develop those policies has been very, very hands-on, and it's not particularly scalable, but there are certain things that I think you may not necessarily want to scale. Sometimes it is most effective to get on a video conference with the people that are directly your constituents, if you want to think of it that way, and hear directly their concerns.
And I can jump in from the GitHub perspective too of how we handle this, because I agree it's a very important aspect of the platform to enable your users, your community to engage in the top level rules as well. And so I mentioned, we're a software development platform. We're also the home of open source. And so open source, as a shorthand, I can just say something about it is that you're enabling communities to iterate together on projects, and we treat our policies as an open source project. So I mentioned that repositories are how people organize their projects on GitHub. We have a repository for all of our site policies. So our terms of service, our acceptable use policies, our privacy statement, all of that is in a repository on GitHub. And we do this in a way to kind of meet our users where they are and say, when we're making changes to any of those policies, you can see in the history of those files what was changed and when. And we allow people to make comments. So you have to sort of maybe dig into GitHub a little bit to really appreciate all of the words I'm saying and how it goes. But basically you can comment on specific lines of code. And since the policies are code, you can comment on the line about harassment and ask a question there. And we're making a change, you'll see it crossed out in red and the new words in green. And this gives people a way to kind of track what we're doing and be able to engage. And when there are major changes, we treat it like a notice and comment period where we give 30 days before, we say, here's what we're planning to do. We'll leave this proposal open for 30 days. It's a pull request for those of you who know the platform. We open a pull request with the document. People can comment on that for 30 days. And then we would make the changes live at the end after we've seen the comments and been able to respond to that. And that gives us an ability to kind of engage with the community, see what they think, and get their input on how we can make things clearer or better, and all of that.
Thank you for the question, Art, and thanks to both of you for those responses. We have a question for Sherwin coming next, but I think it is food for thought for everyone. It's a bit of a challenge. James Salzman says Wikimedia Foundation's recent outreach to Upwork, Fiverr, and other similar gig services seems like the correct approach to stem paid advocacy editing. Systemic bias, such as libertarian austerity-friendly economics bias attracted by co-founder Jimmy Wales' pre-2000 involvement with objectivism, is a completely different issue. And it seems to me that society would be well served to institute regular audits of economic and political biases and disclose those as a part of the Transparency Report publications. His question is, would the foundation please do that? So I think the first thing we have to think through is what would that look like? And how would that be done?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And because part of that is trying to register what an audit for philosophical or political bias might look like. scoring those types of things is actually incredibly difficult in a way that even sensitive and complicated things like racial bias or gender discrimination, in certain contexts, you can find ways to find disparate impacts numerically through hiring practices, through salaries, and so on. Finding a philosophical bias in text semantically is not going to be nearly as easy. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of that it means that choosing that mechanism would be incredibly complicated. And I take the point that the question is talking about transparency, because one of the things that the foundation wouldn't be doing is trying to alter specific, as the foundation, trying to alter specific articles to correct for bias. Certainly there are going to be articles out there that have particular bias based upon who's been interested in it. But the idea usually is, if something's developed in a more insular way, because only 4 or 5 editors keep working on it and reinforcing each other, is to bring more people into that conversation. And hopefully that sort of brings things back more towards normal. Granted, people abuse the idea of there being the cure for bad speech is more speech, but in a more deliberative sort of context, like an encyclopedia article, I think that is something that can work.
Thanks, Sherwin. I mean, I think the spirit of the question is something we can recognize as being tough on Wikipedia, maybe rather than the cure for more speech or for difficult or problematic speech being more speech. The cure is for narrow-minded Wikipedia editors to have more editors across a broader spectrum of identities and belief systems. I mean, certainly I have encountered this issue on Wikipedia myself as someone who had a page written about me that kept getting deleted because I wasn't notable enough. I mean, I'm not here to argue that, but that drew me into an entire conversation about female academics, women scientists, and others who have very, in some cases, notoriously had difficulty getting and keeping their pages up. So I think this issue of who are the editors and how is that group constituted is really where the heart of the issue lies that James was getting at. So thanks for that question, and thanks for the thoughtful answer. We have another really excellent question, and I'm trying to be mindful of time. We have about 10 minutes, I think, Michael, is that right? Do we get to go to the half hour?
Oh, it's till 3:45 actually. So we have.
All right, so we got more time than I thought. Awesome. Okay, so that's great. Keep bringing the questions then, audience, because these are really marvelous. We have one here from Aisha Khan. I think this can go for the whole panel. Aisha's asking about wanting to know more about how you protect contributors who face legitimate threats to their security and freedom from governments and other groups for expressing things that are true but controversial on your services. This is more common in authoritarian regimes, so it would be good to know how problems around censorship are approached in those contexts. So here again, we get to the globality issue and the jurisdictional issues that lead to very real material safety questions for participants. Thanks, Aisha. We'll open that up to the panel.
Well,
I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I can kind of jump on that quickly. So there are a number of ways to do this, and I think one of the most important is transparency. As I mentioned before, we issue a very extensive annual transparency report that includes details of all of the global government requests that we get, either requests for takedown or requests for individual user data. And I think that that's very important that governments know that exists, because that in itself can be a deterrent from kind of government abuse of the system. Secondarily, I think that there's a lot in the actual product design that can be done to protect people who might be at risk from authoritarian governments, and specifically in the types of data that you collect or don't collect about your users. So we have been extremely deliberate in minimizing the data that Reddit collects about its users. We are a pseudonymous platform. We do not require you to give us your real name. We do not require you to give us all of this personal data. And because we don't have it, we can't turn it over to the government. And I think that that's extremely important.
Excellent point, Jessica. I will echo that notion of, if you don't have the data, you can't be compelled to fork it over. When the Patriot Act was enacted in 2001 in the United States and was considered fairly overreaching by many people in this country, public libraries stopped collecting and holding circulation information for this very reason, because they could not be then compelled to turn it over. So that's a very key model. I think the question then becomes, how do we collectively make those characteristics of a platform known to users, so that when they decide where to spend their political capital or other kinds of speech activity, they know that they're making an informed decision about the features of the platform that might support them or offer them greater protection, just like you described Reddit does. Like, I don't know how many people know what the implications of it being a pseudonymous platform really are on, again, in the kind of layperson community. Sherwin, I know you were going to jump in on that one as well. Can we turn to you for thoughts?
Sure. I think, sorry about the connection issue, but one of the things about, like Reddit, Wikipedia is meant to be a pseudonymous service. So people have that choice not to use, and in fact, often are encouraged not to use their real names. And that's definitely going to help when people are working from repressive regimes. And that's a big part of why we have our transparency report the way it is. A lot of people talking about content moderation and transparency these days are talking about trying to have transparency in the modes of content moderation. But really, sort of the origins of our transparency report are reporting on government requests for user information. Which would come under things like the Patriot Act or from other governments. So that's part of that origin. We do, in terms of user safety, we do have a trust and safety team that will step in when necessary, as we can, to try and help people. But oftentimes, that's that can be a complicated situation. But they are there and will actively investigate cases of harassment.
Yeah, and I can sort of just echo a lot of this too. I mean, we also rely very heavily on our transparency report to help people understand, what we're facing in terms of both government takedowns and also government requests for information. And we, in terms of, we also have a trust and safety team that is, here to receive requests and help when there are issues around harassment as well. And we're also a pseudonymous platform and collect the minimum amount of information that we need. So I think, it's good and interesting to see the similarities, I think, across these platforms, that a lot of us kind of understand the gravity of what it means to host, what users are facing when they're posting content, and us as hosting platforms, how we can help navigate those situations.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks to all three of you. Yeah, it is interesting to see how the resonances across these three very different services with very different ends and intentions are being drawn out through this conversation, and essentially formulating some sort of potential best practices, right? One of the problems, I think, with a lot of the larger commercial platforms is that there is there really isn't a formal body to communicate these issues, frankly, and to the same ends, because these are sources of market differentiation, how moderation happens and to what extent and what the level of tolerance is. Those are actually now platform features. So this discussion among the three of you is really illuminating in offering up some different models that are also successful and are proving to stand the test of time. We have two more really provocative questions, really interesting questions that I'd like to put to you. This next one comes from Michael, who is our convener, and he's wondering, he's noting that all three of the platforms represented here harness the energies of your respective communities and depend on positive engagement and goodwill. What do you think are some of the ingredients to foster and maintain that goodwill upon which the engagement is predicated?
I suppose communication and making sure that you have those the ability for users, moderators, community members to engage with others and with us. You know, and the fact, part of it is us making sure that we're holding ourselves out as stewards of the servers, of the technical aspects, and not as drivers of the content. So that's part of it. But also there's multiple different modes and forums by which people communicate. And that has to do with how heterogeneous the community is. Some people are the ones who are constantly on talk pages, who are always at the village pump, who are present when we have conferences. Other people want to contribute simply by adding content. Other people tend to contribute or tend to communicate to us via email or sometimes Twitter. And these segments of the community don't always overlap. So making sure that we have all of those channels open and are able to meet, as I think Abby said, meet the community where it is, really helps. I don't think we do it perfectly, but that's how we try to maintain that.
It's such a good question, and I think it definitely has implications beyond the online sphere. I mean, it's one of those fundamental questions of kind of humans living in a society. But for us, I will echo some of what Sherwin said, and it's it has a lot to do with how you communicate and how available you are to communicate with users who have concerns. And we see ourselves as part of the community. And I think that that's really, really important. We're also seen as part of the community. Like when you're a Reddit admin, as our employees are called, you've got, you know, a presence on the site and you can chime in conversations. And there are a number of admin run subreddits where we'll do things that other companies of course do, like post our transparency report or post a product update. But for us, it's not just living on a static blog post. We post it on the website in a subreddit, and then the users ask us questions and engage about it. And so we'll always sit there anytime we make a product announcement and kind of answer the questions of the community directly. And it's not just like a PR voice, it's, you know, a specific product manager who built that, doing that. And I think that that's really unique. And again, that's something that is done by everyone up to and including our CEO. He'll get on the platform and do AMAs, Ask Me Anythings, directly with the users periodically. We'll do that when we release our transparency report. And then, as I mentioned before, we've been engaging a lot more in kind of face-to-face direct conversations with certain moderator constituencies so that, you know, they can tell us their concerns directly, and we're checking in with them and we're understanding what tools they want us to build, what things they want us to prioritize, what stuff that we've done that they don't like and they want us to roll back. And so, yeah, that communication, I think it can be scary for companies at first, and certainly can be scary the first time you do it. But once you do it and you kind of start flexing that muscle, it's so satisfying, because I love talking to the users of Reddit because they're all just so interesting and unique, and they have really thoughtful perspectives on.
Yeah, and similarly, this is reminding me a bit of how I was mentioning the engagement we have with our users around our policies, and just sort of, it does seem daunting at first when you get out there and you're posting things and you're ready for people to kind of, you know, come in and comment as they would on any other project on your platform. But it's really gratifying. It's really great. You get wonderful like things you wouldn't necessarily realize. Okay, this might have actually been way more confusing than we meant it. And let's just change a word here or there and everybody understands now. So, you know, I echo that. I think it's a really excellent thing in terms of building goodwill and helping the platform just be more successful in building a great community that understands each other, understands what we're trying to build as well. And I think earlier on, I was mentioning, you know, the resources that we provide for communities. I'll drop one in chat, this open source guide, which has a bunch of different guides in there. And one of them is around building welcoming communities and being best practice for maintainers, I think is one of them, something along those lines. So we try to kind of help, again, give people the information they need, empower them with the information they need, as well as the tools to be able to kind of succeed in this role. And so I think that also helps, that goes a long way towards, I think in the long run, building goodwill. Like, here's a platform that cares about this outcome and is going to help me do a good job here. And I think that hopefully will help them feel good about, you know, deciding to put their project there.
Thank you, panelists. And thanks for that excellent question. Our audience member, Art, responds that it's a great point to note that those policy announcements are not being posted in a walled off part of the platform, but in fact, there's often a bi-directional engagement going on, which I imagine would go significantly to building an easing of the way for new policy once users have felt like they've had some buy-in and some participation, right? I guess we call that democracy, I guess. So we have a couple more questions. Art, I know you had another one, but I'd like to reach out to a couple folks who haven't asked questions yet and get those in because they're quite compelling. So Sapni asks a really great question here, which is, as automation increases in content moderation, how could explainability for decisions of those automated tools be communicated on the platform within this federated structure to the user or content generators? So how are those tools being integrated, and how are their outcomes and their functioning being articulated to the users all the way down the model that you have of federated governance?
So
Yeah, I will say,
for Wikimedia's perspective, sorry.
Go ahead.
The idea is that most of these automated tools aren't deployed and allowed to run on their own. Each of them is going to be implemented and executed by a human. So the idea is that the tools are developed, the automated tools are developed as a way to augment and assist what a human editor is doing to make their work more efficient, not to have the automated tool be the first instance of judgment on content. There are very few exceptions to that. Again, like the things that are looking for the all caps, all caps profanity. But with those very narrow exceptions where the explainability is very much on the surface, the bots themselves, their functions, and oftentimes their code are available for users to look at. That explainability is paramount.
Yeah, we're
Go
starting
ahead,
to sound like a broken record, but for us, it is largely the same. I am personally very skeptical of being able to automate many of the nuanced decisions of content moderation, because the moment that you look at these queues and the types of things that are coming in, you recognize that not only can a machine probably not make the right decision, but you can have like 6 extremely smart, thoughtful humans and they won't agree on it. And so as Sherwin said, I think we tend to use the automated tools more to empower those humans to be able to not so much make the right decisions, but to ensure that we're getting to the most serious stuff first. So we use automation, for example, to prioritize the queues. So, there are certain things that are illegal or are kind of immediately physically harmful to someone, and that will always go to the top of the list for a human review and actioning. But the interesting thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, we do provide automated tools for some of our community moderators so that they're not having to kind of take down the very obvious things manually. And for that, like most things on Reddit, the moderators have been enormously thoughtful about how to be transparent about that. And so one thing that is pretty common for many of our communities to do is just publicize what their auto moderator rules are. That's the tool that we call it. And it's, it's a bot basically that they've programmed. So they will just put in a link to the programming of that bot so that you can go in and see exactly what the rules are and what's going to be taken down.
Yeah, and again, broken record continues a bit. We also aren't, to the extent there is automation, it's about the workflows and helping our human moderators get to the stuff that's more demanding sooner. It's not about having robots make decisions that, traditionally we've always had humans do, because we like Jessica said, we have, I think one of you said, I think it was Jessica, we have plenty of discussions where like 6 or 8 of us sit around and, have really good points on either side. And, even just trying to get to a decision there can be really hard. So I can't imagine if, you're trusting that to entirely automated system, how that would go.
Thank you. I think, just again, drawing on some of the through lines that I'm hearing from all of the panelists, what is at the foundation of success for these models is ultimately user trust that they grant to the platform, right? And so this function of responding with your transparency or with mechanisms for engagement seems to be in the spirit of that. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge issues of scale that allow for some of the flexibility that you have. Now, that's not to say that other platforms are, just by their nature, unable to make some of the decisions that you've made, because they did make the decision to pursue scale over other options. And, that too, to my mind, is a governance decision as well. Like how fast and how big are you willing to grow? And to what extent is that going to impact the experience of your users and how you deploy and enforce the rules, right? So some firms have felt that they're to a point where they have to do a certain amount of frontline automated moderation because there's just too much stuff on the platform. And that seems to me a real point of differentiation among the 3 services we have represented here versus some of the others we might think of. We had another question kind of in this, in the context of human rights and international law and standards around that. And this is coming from Mary Hansel. She says, given the global nature of the 3 platforms, to what extent do you engage with international human rights standards? Does the federated content moderation approach align with those international human rights standards? And if so, how does that look? And if not, how does it diverge? I'll open that to the panel. Did we lose Sherwin? Is he here still?
I'm back.
Okay, hey Sherwin.
Audio. And
Thanks,
just while because I don't want the delay to result in crosstalk. I think the federated nature of each language having its own set of rules, I don't think necessarily creates. I don't think that there's necessarily a conflict with the idea of there being international human rights standards, because international human rights standards are meant to apply across different jurisdictions and set a baseline. So there's certainly a way to have a commonality and common types of rules and baseline conduct standards that apply across jurisdictions. Now, they're not going to be, there's going to be instances where interpretations of those standards are going to be in conflict. And, so that's always going to be an issue. But I don't think that necessarily, I think that the question of federating content moderation across projects is a little bit orthogonal to the question of different national having different interpretations of human rights standards.
Yeah, I agree on that point, that I think the international, the global international level of human rights standards is, I think, in a good spot for platforms to be able to track those while still enabling more local interpretations. And I think for us, I don't think the federated part gets in the way, because I mean, in terms of our terms of service, like in our high level standards, those track really well against the rights to free expression, free association, free assembly. Github has actually made contributions even to those special rapporteurs' reports on the subjects with respect to content moderation or the digital space. So if you're interested, you can see all the details around that I have to say. But just largely speaking, if you think about those rights, they come with limitations. And so our terms of service really track those things well. So for free expression, something like hate speech is a limitation in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So if you think about that as like, again, our high level standard, and then the question about federated standards, how does that work on the community level? Well, a lot of people's codes of conduct are also including a lot of the things that we would say aren't okay at the high level too. So there's not necessarily a discrepancy there. I think the codes of conduct add the extra, the cats on two legs kind of stuff, but they will also largely say, and it's not okay to, you know, invade other people's privacy by doxing them or whatever. And maybe not in so many words, but a lot of times they'll pull language from our acceptable use policies or other kind of high level statements around things that in the end do end up tracking what human rights standards would prescribe. So I think it actually ends up working out pretty well.
Yeah, on the question of human rights, I think that it has more applicability into how platforms deal with some of the more kind of exotic government requests for either data or content takedowns. And on that issue, I have personally been very persuaded by the work of David Kaye when he was the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur. And you know, I think it's important to recognize that whenever we get a legal request from a government, whether it's kind of a government that is perceived to be compliant with human rights or not, we always very carefully scrutinize that request. And if we view the request to be deficient, we will reject the request. And you can see in our transparency report the number of requests that and whether we've complied or not, and what country they've come from. But I think that this does start to get into very tricky territory when you're getting a request that, you know, it would be considered to be incompatible with international human rights norms, and yet it's still coming from a government. And whenever you have the situation of a government, you know, a sovereign actor acting against a corporation, which is just a very different unit in the international system and just certainly does not have the same sovereignty and tools in the international system, then things can become very tricky, because you often do feel, even the largest corporation can feel very small in that situation. And that's where I think that it's very, very important that national governments that value human rights be champions of human rights online. And it's especially important for them to model human rights norms online, because I've been personally very troubled by the tendency of some legislation in countries that we would consider to be otherwise paragons of human rights, but they've been very, very draconian when it comes to internet governance. And what you see is almost an authoritarian learning curve, where you have countries like Russia looking at the text of the NetzDG, for example, and essentially incorporating parts of it whole cloth into their own statutes in a way that kind of makes those takedown requests much more pernicious and much more difficult to deal with.
Thank you to all three of you for really nuanced and interesting responses. Sherwin, do you want to make the comment that you made in the chat in voice?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to note that, like, when we're talking about international human rights standards, oftentimes people are talking about standards that are typically used to apply to nation states. And while there are many people have been drawing a lot of analogies between sometimes some of the larger platforms and nation states, a private actor from speech in ways that you would definitely want to preclude a nation state from moderating. So that can lead to some types of flexibility as well. But also that's not meant to be in tension with what Jessica.
Okay, thank you for the responses. I want to note that Michael has been dropping a couple of links to some interesting papers in the chat. Will the chat be available after the discussion, Michael? Do you know?
I mean, I will have a copy because we're recording the session, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure if it'll be. I think that
Okay.
like the transcript gets recorded as part of that, but I don't know
Yep.
that we probably won't be putting that up on the page in the same way, just because yeah.
So everyone take a look right
Yes.
now at some of those links. And Abby, I know you also put in a link as well. I think we've heard a lot about each of your transparency reports. If you happen to have the link to the most recent at hand and you would be willing to drop that in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, folks can find those with a fair bit of ease just by searching for them. We are up on time. I had the moderator's prerogative of having a couple questions, but we're up at time. So I will just have to hold those for another time. But just to give you an idea of what I was thinking about, after hearing these successful overall models, what it might look like for some larger firms to maybe change their tack and look at some of these more community-based, more tangible, friction-based kinds of moderation styles and how that might change some of the user experiences on the platforms. And then the other question I had was thinking about how all three services represented here today rely on volunteer labor of community moderators at that first layer of the federated model. And I wondered how it would look if that were to change to a paid kind of activity. But you don't have to answer that because we're at time. I just wanted to put the questions on the table. If any of you ever want to talk about that, we can do that on the side. But this was a fascinating conversation. And of course, we just barely got started and got rolling and we're at time. I'd like to thank all three of you for giving of your Saturday to this discussion. Thanks to Michael for the organizing efforts, and to Yale Law School and all those involved there for making this happen. We have a huge audience today and a really engaged one. So thanks so much to all of you for joining us. And I think we are at time and we are at a wrap.
Yeah. I'll just say quickly again, thanks to you for excellent moderating, and thanks to all of our panelists as well. I knew this was going to be an excellent conversation, but it really has been like a perfect capstone on the discussions that we've had on the last couple of days, because so many of the issues that were brought up and the sort of challenges that were brought up around transparency, around engagement with users, building relationships and communication, around friction, like all of that stuff came up in the previous sessions as to like, gosh, these are problems. So thank you to the panelists for resolving all of these enormous challenges that people have brought up on the previous sessions. It's been a great conversation and I very much appreciate it. And and one last quick plug, if anybody wants to join us at 10 a.m. on the Monday for our sort of civil society post wrap-up discussion, yes, that's going to happen on Monday as well. But thank you all. This has been a great conversation, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, this was where the rubber met the road, I'll say. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.